Hey guys, welcome back. So first things first, just want to say a massive thank you to everyone who has subscribed so far, everyone who's watching and leaving comments. Really, really appreciate it. Still a long way to go, but I think just the more I carry on, the more subscribers and everything's going to go up. So if you can just like and share this video, let's get the algorithm started. That'd be really appreciated. So today's case, I decided to do it on a couple of factors. Originally, I wasn't going to, but my friend recommended it to me a few weeks ago, and it's kind of ironic, knowing that she got released from prison a couple of days ago. So I will be talking about the Gypsy Rose Blanchard case. The other reason that I decided to do it was when this story originally came out, so in 2015, I actually didn't think it was a real story. It sounded like a plot line from Hollyoaks, if I'm honest, because it just seemed so far fetched. And I know that Munchausen's and Munchausen's by proxy, they are real, real illnesses. I mean, obviously now I know they call it fictitious disorder, but the level of abuse that was in this story, it just made me question the actual realness of it. It wasn't until a couple of years ago that I watched a program called The Act, and in that, from watching that program, I looked up the case and I actually realised that this wasn't made up. Like, this actually really happened. So, if you could just guys do me a favour, like, share, and subscribe, that would be really appreciated. And we're just going to have a little deep dive look into the case of Gypsy Rose and the murder of Dee Dee Blanchard. So, it's always imperative for me in these stories to go back to the beginning. So we're just going to have a little look at Dee Dee's background before we get into what actually happened and what shaped Dee Dee. So Dee Dee was born Claudine Pitre in Chuck Bay, Louisiana. So this is a place that's quite near the Gulf Coast. And she was born in 1967. And she grew up with her family in nearby Golden Meadow. And she was one of 5 children of Claude Anthony Petre Sr. and Emma Lois Gliscare. And during her teenage years, Dee Dee actually entered pageants as a beauty queen. So these images are available online if you do want to have a look. Because she, for all intents and purposes, like, Dee Dee wasn't a bad looking woman when she was growing up. It was just, as she was growing up, the monster that she became more apparent. So relatives recalled that Dee Dee had a really bad habit of stealing from her family, and they speculated it was a form of retaliation when things just didn't go her way. So already they were seeing the attention-seeking behaviour within Dee Dee by just these like little petty sort of small-timey crimes. At some point early in her adult life, Dee Dee worked as a nurse's aide, and the family expressed suspicion that in 1997 she possibly killed her own mother by denying her food. So while it was proved that her mum did actually die due to malnutrition, they couldn't pinpoint it down to what actually caused this. It was speculated that Dee Dee was indeed her carer because of her nursing background, but as far as I'm aware, there was not really much proof out there that Dee Dee was the one actually responsible for her death. So When Dee Dee was 24, she became pregnant by Rob Blanchard, who was only 17 at the time. And they named their daughter Gypsy Rose because Dee Dee actually liked the name Gypsy, and Rod was a massive fan of the American band Guns N' Roses. Shortly before Gypsy Rose's birth in July 1991, the couple then separated, so they actually got married in a really quick shotgun wedding, and obviously they knew further down the line that things just weren't going to work out. You know, you only have to look at the age gap. Yeah, I know there's a lot of age gap couples out there that do work in the long run, but when you're 17, you have a lot of different life experiences to what a 24-year-old would have. And I think, you know, that's just obviously one of the major factors of probably why this relationship just didn't end up working out. So the couple separated when Rod realised he got married for the wrong reasons, and he resisted Dee Dee's efforts to get him to return, and she then took her newborn daughter away to live with her family. And according to Rod, who remained involved with Gypsy at this point, by the time Gypsy was 3 months old, Dee Dee was convinced that Gypsy had sleep apnea. So for those of you who don't know what sleep apnea is, it's a condition which the person who is asleep, it restricts their breathing, usually very loud snoring, usually not all the time, but people who suffer with sleep apnea usually have to wear a specialist mask which pumps air into their system. It's usually something that's attributed to overweight people. Not all the time, but majority of the cases, the people tend to be overweight. And what happens is when you lay back, obviously your airways get restricted. For that to happen in a 3-month-old baby is really unheard of, really rare. I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but I don't really think that personally it could. I may be wrong. If you want to point out and comment if I'm wrong or not, if you've got anything to back that up, then please feel free and let me know. So Dee Dee at this point was taking Gypsy quite frequently to the hospitals about the sleep apnea, and she had to go to sleep clinics, and it was reported, which repeated with overnight stays in the hospital while they were concurring these tests. But all of these tests, they found no sign of sleep apnea whatsoever in Gypsy. And Dee Dee subsequently, she became convinced that Gypsy had a wide range of health issues, which she attributed to an unsuspected chromosomal disorder, and that she had been oxygen starved at birth. So as Gypsy was growing older, these wide range of conditions that she was reported to have had, like Dee Dee was saying that she had, it escalated and escalated. So not only was she apparently having trouble sleeping or breathing during her sleep, she went on to say that Gypsy had muscular dystrophy and made her use a walker. This eventuated into Gypsy having leukemia. So when Gypsy was a child, she repeatedly had to have her head shaved to look the part. And you can imagine that is a lot going on in anyone's body, let alone a child by the age of 10 who reportedly has all these conditions. So Gypsy actually said herself that when she was around 7 or 8, she was riding on her grandfather's motorcycle, and they were involved in what she described as a really minor accident. And she only obtained like a graze on her knee, just tiny little thing. And Dee Dee then said that the doctors had given her a wheelchair that she would need to use, as she was now paralysed from the waist down from the accident. And Dee Dee also said at this point that Gypsy had leukemia. So obviously, as I've already said, she then told her daughter that she had leukemia, and this is when she began shaving her head, and even had a feeding tube inserted into Gypsy, like claiming that she was having trouble swallowing. So Gypsy often went with her parents to Special Olympics events. In 2001, when Dee Dee claimed Gypsy was 8, so she was actually 10 years old at this point, but Dee Dee would lie to Gypsy and say that she was younger than what she was. And this age gap, sorry, it was getting noticeably bigger as the years went by. So when she was, which she believed she was 8, um, she was named the honorary queen of the crew of Mid City, which was a child orientated parade held during the Mardi Gras in New Orleans. So around this time as well, Gypsy seemed to have been stopped from going to school around second grade. Obviously, I'm not American, I'm British. When we go to school over here, we go by year 6, year 7, things like that. So if anyone could just highlight what second grade actually is, what year that would represent in the UK, that'd be really appreciated. Because that sort of stuff just kind of escapes my mind, if I'm honest. So this homeschooling that Dee Dee was given to Gypsy, this reportedly, it can't be proved, but it reportedly started when Gypsy was only in infants. And this was because her apparent illnesses were so severe, and it was later believed to have been an attempt to isolate Gypsy from her to further her abuse. And she really just didn't really bother like teaching Gypsy. I didn't teach Gypsy nothing, not even to read or write. Gypsy actually learned to read through her own volition by reading Harry Potter books, which I sort of relate with because when I was around that age, I mean, there's only a year's difference, if that, about 9 months, I think, uh, between myself and how old Gypsy is now. Um, so growing up, obviously, yeah, like Harry Potter would have been like a massive part of our lives, and I got uh, quite good at reading. Not so much nowadays, but other than obviously doing what I'm doing now, I don't really have the time to read a lot of books. But growing up, I was obsessed with Harry Potter books. Sorry, I kind of digressed a little bit there. Let's just get back to the story. So Gypsy's father at this point had remarried, and Dee Dee moved in with her father and stepmother. And they later said that when preparing food for her stepmom, Dee Dee was poisoning it with Roundup weed killer, and this led to her stepmother having chronic illness during this period. And during this time as well, Dee Dee was arrested for quite a lot of minor offences, so like writing bad checks. And when the Peters began to regularly confront her about the treatment of Gypsy and the expressed suspicion about her role in her stepmother's health, Dee Dee then took Gypsy and moved to New Orleans, his little suburb called Siddle. And miraculously, as soon as Dee Dee left this home, her stepmother began regaining full health. So while in Siddle, Dee Dee and Gypsy lived in a public housing, and they paid their bills with Rod's child support payments and also public assistance. So that would be the American benefit system. And this money was awarded to Dee Dee to take care of her daughters. It's sort of like carers allowance, what you would get in the UK. This was obviously awarded based on the apparent illnesses that Gypsy was reported to be suffering with. So around this time, obviously Dee Dee was taking Gypsy to a lot of specialist consultants, mostly at the Tulane Medical Center and the Children's Hospital in New Orleans. And she just repeatedly sought treatment for the illnesses that she was claiming Gypsy had, which now included hearing and vision problems. And while a muscle biopsy found no sign of muscular dystrophy, Dee Dee just insisted that Gypsy had it, and she was successful in securing treatment for Gypsy's other purported issues. And after she told doctors that Gypsy had seizures every few months, they prescribed anti-seizure medication, and several surgeries were performed on Gypsy during this time. And Dee Dee was reportedly a regular visitor at the minor accidents room with Gypsy. So in 2005, so August 2005, obviously some parts of America were really badly affected by Hurricane Katrina. I remember this story really, really well. And Dee Dee and Gypsy had to leave their apartment for a shelter in Covington, and this was set up with people with special needs. Dee Dee said that Gypsy's medical records, including birth certificate and everything else, anything to do with her ID, this was all destroyed in the floods of Hurricane Katrina. At first, Dee Dee and Gypsy lived in a small rented home in Aurora in southwestern Missouri, and during their time there, Gypsy was honoured by the Oli Foundation, which advocates for the rights of feeding tube recipients, and she was given the crown as the 2007 Child of the Year. In 2008, Habitat for Humanity built them a small home with a wheelchair ramp and a hot tub as part of a larger project for the north side of Springfield. And the two moved into this house, and they were awarded with a brand new car. This house came with everything they need, like a specialist wheelchair ramp. The light switch were lowered for Gypsy to use. It even came with its own hot tub, and the house was painted pink. I mean, obviously, obviously everyone knows about this case. So I'm saying if you've seen the house, the picture of the house, you'll see what it's like. Absolutely built custom just for Gypsy's apparent needs. So the story of the single mother with a severely disabled daughter forced to flee Hurricane Katrina. Sorry, I was about to cough them. There you go. So obviously, yeah, the story of the single mum and the severely disabled daughter fleeing Hurricane Katrina, this caused a media sensation within this town that they had gone to, so Springfield. And the community often pitched in to help Dee Dee, who by now had changed her name to Claudine. And the outpouring of support included many charitable contributions. So just to pause there a little bit, so it's really suspected that Dee Dee changed her name slightly, just so obviously if anyone wanted to dig up her past, it would be really difficult for them to do. Um, but obviously, she had to keep something that was very close to her original name, just so obviously she could still go by the name of Dee Dee. She would answer to that because there would be no point going from Claudine to Steph, for example. Um, because obviously, if anyone sees her in the supermarket or anything, and they're trying to talk to her, Dee Dee, Dee Dee, well, and she's not answering, then or sorry, no, going by the name of Steph, sorry, and they're shouting Steph or whatever, and she's not answering, it's gonna raise a lot of suspicion. So if she just changes the vowel ever so slightly, she can still go by the name of Dee Dee, but if anyone looks up the name of Claudine Blanchard, nothing's really going to come up unless they do really, really deep digging. I don't know if America have the same sort of things in the UK as, for example, Clare's Law and things like that, where you can actually look up someone's history through the police. Again, if someone wants to highlight that down below, then please feel free. So at this point in Louisiana, Dee Dee and Gypsy had avowed themselves to occasional stays at a Ronald McDonald house. This was during Gypsy's many unnecessary medical treatments. And in Missouri, they received free flights to see doctors at Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas, free trips to Disney World, and backstage passes to Miranda Lambert concerts. And Gypsy would frequently photograph with Miranda, and Miranda even gave them $3,000 personally via the Make a Wish Foundation. And Rob also continued to make his monthly child support payments of $12,000, as well as sending Gypsy gifts and occasionally talking to her on the phone. And he even rung up on what he believed was, what he knew, sorry, was Gypsy's 18th birthday. And he vividly recalls Dee Dee telling him not to mention Gypsy's real age, as she believed at this point that she was 14. So Rob and his second wife hoped to get to Springfield and visit, but obviously every time this was coming up, Dee Dee was making up excuse after excuse after excuse as to why they couldn't come. And she told her neighbours that Gypsy's father was an abusive drug addict and an alcoholic, and he just basically didn't accept Gypsy because of her medical issues, which is really, I mean, obviously this woman's a compulsive liar anyway, but that is a really severe lie to tell about someone, because obviously if this guy ever did turn up, then you know what small towns are like. You know, when they feel like they need to get involved, they will get involved. So a doctor from the Ozarks suggested that they relocate to her native Missouri, and the next month they were airlifted there. And many people who met Gypsy, they were charmed, really, really charmed by her. Her tiny 5 foot frame, her nearly toothless mouth, her large glasses, and a high, really high pitched, reedy, childlike voice. This really warmed people's hearts. And all of this just reinforced the perception that she did have all of the issues that her mother was leading people to believe. And like I said, obviously Gypsy, at this point, she was regularly having her head shaved by Dee Dee to reinforce the claim that she had leukemia. And she said she would just basically tell the Gypsy, sorry, that she had to do it because the medication that she was taking for the leukemia, it would cause her hair to fall out naturally anyway. So this was just speeding up the process. So when they left the house, Dee Dee often took an oxygen tank and feeding tube with them, and Gypsy was fed the children's liquid nutrition supplement Pediasure well into her 20s. Dee Dee would then often use physical abuse to keep her tight control over Gypsy. Always holding her hand in the presence of others. And if Gypsy said something that suggested she was older than what she was claiming to be, if it was something that alluded that she was a bit more intelligent than what her mother was crediting her for, Dee Dee would squeeze her hand really, really tight. And that's almost as if like sending a message out saying, remember who you are, like remember what I told you. So the medical interventions at this point, they just continued, and Dee 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 had some of Gypsy's saliva glands treated with Botox, and eventually these were removed altogether. And this was because Dee Dee said that Gypsy was continuously drooling. And Gypsy later claimed that her mother induced the drooling by using a topical anaesthetic to numb her gums. This was always before a doctor's visit, so it would give the appearance and everyone would believe Dee Dee's claims. So the lack of the saliva glands, coupled with the side effects of the anti-seizure medication, this already caused Gypsy's decaying teeth to decay even further, and she ended up having to have a full extraction, and this was eventually placed by a bridge. And then she also had tubes inserted into her ears, and this was because apparently she was continuously having ear infections. So the whole entire time during this medical abuse and medical failings, there was only one doctor who kind of saw through Dee Dee's claims. His name was Bernardo Flatterstein. So he was a paediatric neurologist who saw Gypsy in Springfield, and he was the one that actually became suspicious of her muscular dystrophy diagnosis. He went out and ordered MRIs, blood tests. He found no abnormalities in Gypsy whatsoever. In fact, in one meeting with Dee Dee, he basically said to her, well, I don't see why this child isn't walking. And this was on a follow-up visit after he basically witnessed Gypsy standing and supporting her own weight. And Flatterstein noticed that Dee Dee was not a good historian whatsoever. And that's really important. If you're going to invent a lie, you need to remember that lie to go back on, because that way, that's when liars get caught out, is when they can't remember what they've said and they fabricate something else, and you're just like, well, no, because ABC, you said this on this particular day or this particular time. So after contacting Gypsy's doctors in New Orleans, he learned that Gypsy's original muscle biopsy had come back negative, and this undermined Dee Dee's reported diagnosis of the muscular dystrophy, as well as her claims that Gypsy's records had been destroyed by the flooding. He suspected the possibility of the Munchausens by proxy. Dee Dee contrived to gain access to his notes and subsequently stopped taking Gypsy to go see him. And Flassenstein did not follow up by reporting Dee Dee to social services. And he actually said that other doctors told him to treat Dee Dee and Gypsy with golden gloves. So, by meaning that obviously because they were local celebrities, that everyone knew them, they had to have the specialist treatment. And he went on to say that he started doubting himself and he doubted that the authorities would believe anything that he was saying. In 2009, an anonymous caller told the police about Dee Dee's use of different names and birthdays for herself and her daughter, and suggested Gypsy was in better health than what was claimed. And the officers who performed the wellness check accepted Dee Dee's explanation that she used the misinformation to make it harder for her abusive ex-husband to find her and Gypsy. And this was out without talking to Rod. And it was reported that Gypsy seems genuinely mentally disabled, and the case was actually closed down. So you can just think how close it came, that Dee Dee got the justice that she deserved, possibly by going to prison. Gypsy would have got the justice she deserved, which was her freedom, way earlier, and it wouldn't have resulted in Gypsy having spent the next 8 years in prison. So Dee Dee seemed to have at least once forged a copy of Gypsy's birth certificate by changing her birthday to 1995, and this was just to bolster the claims that she was still a teenager. Gypsy said in a later interview that for 14 years she was not sure of her actual real age. She sometimes also claimed that the original had been destroyed during the post-Katrina flooding, and Dee Dee did keep another copy with Gypsy's real birthday, and Gypsy recalls seeing it during one of their hospital visits, and she recalls being really confused by this. And when she brought it up, Dee Dee just basically said to her it was a misprint. So just to jump back a little bit in time, so back to 2001, so Gypsy had actually been attending science fiction and fantasy conventions, and sometimes she would go in costume. Like we see this in childhood photos of Gypsy. She was, always dressed up in costumes of Disney characters and all that. Cosplay, that's the word I was looking for. And this way she could blend into the inclusive communities in her wheelchair. And at a particular 2011 event, she made a first attempt at an escape plan. And this was when she made friends with a man online, I believe. And she ended up going to this guy's house in a way to escape from Dee Dee's control. And Dee Dee, very, very quickly, she found out where Gypsy was and turned up at this guy's address, took Gypsy home, and she remembers Dee Dee confronting the guy and basically threatening to report him to the police for having sex with a minor. Because obviously at this particular time, 2011, I was 19, Gypsy would have been almost 20. But obviously, like I said, Dee Dee was claiming that she was a lot younger, so around this point she would have been claiming that Gypsy was 16, because obviously the legal age of sex in America is 18, I believe, in some states. I think it's a little bit older in some, but I'm sure majority of states in America is 18. So Gypsy recalls that afterward, Dee Dee smashed her computer with a hammer and threatened to threatened to ring the police about getting conservatorship over Gypsy. And sometime around 2012, Gypsy, she continued to use the internet, and this was only after Dee Dee had gone to bed, and this was obviously not arouse any suspicion, or arouse Dee Dee's temper. So around this time in 2012 was when Gypsy first made contact with Nicholas Godejohn. He lived in Big Bend, Wisconsin at the time, so this is around 500 miles away from Gypsy's house. And he worked as a sign holder outside a pizza restaurant. And Gypsy said that the two had met on a Christian dating site. So Nicholas relatively lived a quiet life. In fact, he only had one conviction, and I mean, obviously, it was a fairly serious thing that he got arrested for. He was actually found to be watching porn and masturbating in a McDonald's restaurant. Not always the best thing to do, especially if I know there's some people that claim that there was a family, or there was quite a few families in the restaurant at the time. Could be the case. I did read one report that this went on for about 9 hours. That one I really struggled to believe, to be honest. Maybe 9 minutes you could get away with it. To sit there and masturbate for 9 hours, I think in a restaurant like McDonald's, I think someone's going to realise, someone's going to notice. So Nicholas himself, he had a history of mental illnesses, and sometimes this was reported as dissociative identity disorder, so DID, and he also had autism. And during these conversations, Gypsy would tell him about her own ailments, and she would ask if he felt any different about her. So you can imagine with someone who, like Gypsy, who believed at this point of all the ailments that she was reported to have, that having DID and autism was like water off a duck's batter. It wouldn't mean anything, because, as I was saying, this girl has been brought up to believe that she needs a feeding tube. She's paralysed. She's got muscular dystrophy, leukemia, got as well. She has to have multitude of operations just to reportedly stay alive. And to hear someone's not only got, but to hear someone's got DID or autism, it probably wouldn't register with Gypsy. She probably wouldn't know what they were at some point. She probably would have researched it, but also, like I said, with everything that she had going on, this probably would have seemed like nothing to her. So in 2014, so at this point, the pair had been talking for around 2 years. Gypsy confided to 23-year-old neighbour Alia Woodmansey, who was actually unaware at this point that Gypsy was close to her own age than what she was led to believe, like everyone else. Alia at this point considered herself like a big sister to Gypsy, and Gypsy confided in her about Nicholas and discussed about eloping, and even discussed potential children that she was going to have with Nicholas. And Gypsy actually ended up setting up 5 different Facebook accounts just to keep in contact. And Nicholas would just spend all the time flirting online, and these exchanges sometimes used a BDSM context, which this then evolved into fantasies about rape role plays. So, for those of you who are unaware, there is a genre of BDSM, or a role playing BDSM, sorry, called CNC, which stands for consensual non-consent. And it just basically is what it says on the tin. It's a rape role play. Two consenting adults act out, someone being the abuser, someone being the victim, and I think it's supposed to be like the danger and the excitement of it is what turns people on, especially if you are, as described, dominant and submissive. So the submissive would really, each person is getting something out of this. So it might seem like really outlandish to you, but for people who are practicing and enjoy BDSM, this would be nothing to them. This possibly even sound vanilla to them in many respects. And obviously, there's nothing wrong with being vanilla. If you're into, you're into. So, Gypsy at this point, she claimed that this was more what Nick was into. He was more the one that was bolstering about the whole BDSM context of their relationship. And he even at some point sent her a masters and slave contract online. And this is something that you can actually Google and download for yourself. You can send it to the person, you can fill that out, and Bob's your uncle, Fanny's your uncle. Obviously, it's not a legal document, I appreciate that, but it's just another part of the fantasy. So it's very similar to what happens in 50 Shades of Grey. So Nicholas ended up confiding in Gypsy about alter egos of his, and one of these was called Victor, who was a 550-year-old vampire, and another who was an unnamed character, but this unnamed character was his evil side, and his evil side enjoyed bloodlust, but enjoyed killing, enjoyed the whole CNC thing, but making it real. And in return, Gypsy, she then creates her own alter egos, and there's Candy, who was her slutty side. There was Ruby, who was her evil side, and I think there was another one that was called Kitty, which probably would have been her really cutesy sort of bubblegum side. And Alia, at this point, when she's hearing all this, she tries to talk Gypsy out of it, still thinking that Gypsy was way too young and possibly being taken advantage of by a predator or a paedophile. She considered in her head that Gypsy's plans were just fantasies and dreams, and that nothing like this would ever really take place. And despite Dee Dee's efforts to prevent Gypsy from using the internet, which went as far as destroying Gypsy's phone and laptop, Gypsy maintained contact with Nicholas, and she even saved printouts of all their posts, up until 2014. So the next year, Gypsy and Nicholas, they decided to elevate their relationship to the next step. So at this point, obviously the two had never met in person. The beginning of 2015, the pair decided that it's time that they want to meet in person. And so they arranged a plan for Nicholas to meet Gypsy and her mother Dee Dee. And in Gypsy's head, she was thinking that she would have that Dee Dee would just accepted Nicholas there and then. The plan was for him to just sort of casually bump into them while she and Dee Dee were at a movie theatre. And at this point, the plan was for Gypsy and Dee Dee to go watch I think it was the live remake of Cinderella that was released that year, and they were both going to be there in costume. And Nicholas would, turn up, act like the chivalrous gentleman. Dee Dee would really, really like him, and they would be able to, have quality time together in person. And from the moment they met, so Gypsy ended up stealing some money from Dee Dee to send to Nicholas for him to get the Greyhound bus to do the 500-mile journey. And Nick said as soon as Dee Dee clapped eyes on him, she hated him right away. And you can kind of understand, obviously it's Dee Dee probably feels that, if Gypsy's paying attention to someone else, she's going to lose all of her control over her, what she thinks is more of her protege rather than her flesh and blood, her own daughter. And if Gypsy slips up at any one point, then it's game over for her. So Dee Dee was reportedly have said that she thought it was weird a grown man was at the cinema alone to watch a Disney film, and I kind of get that a little bit. I understand obviously there are some adults that are really into Disney, and I accept that it's not really for me, but I do accept that a lot of people do love Disney. But I kind of get that viewpoint of an adult man going to the cinema to watch a Disney film on his own, and then striking up a conversation with what appears to be a severely disabled girl. So is there some point that during this film that Gypsy led Nick to the bathroom and the two actually had sex? And they reportedly done this in the handicap stalls. But then on the journey home, and this kind of shows you how naive that Gypsy actually is, she messages Godejohn and basically says to him that you make my girly parts tingle. So at some point after this, they basically continued their internet interactions, and they actually began developing a plan to murder Dee Dee. And they discussed whether Dee Dee was a light sleeper or not, and whether it was best to use a knife. And with that set in plan, Gypsy, she went and stole duct tape, she stole a knife, she stole gloves, all from Walmart while she was out on a shopping trip with Dee Dee. So Nick ended up returning to Springfield in June 2015 and arrived while Gypsy and Dee Dee were away for a doctor's appointment. and Gypsy again has sent him the money for the transport. And after they had returned home, Dee Dee had gone to sleep. Nick went to the house, and Gypsy was reportedly to just basically let him in, handed him the duct tape, the gloves, and the knife. And there was, in his head, that was the understanding that he was to murder Dee Dee and take away the girl that he loves. And Gypsy hid in the bathroom and covered her ears so she wouldn't have to hear her mum screaming. And Nick then stabbed Dee Dee 17 times in her back and slashed the back of her neck. And he claimed that one of the stabs, it went in a bit too deep, and he believed that it went into her lung, because the knife was really difficult to get out. And it was some point during this as well that he cut his own hand with the knife, which is an absolute forensic nightmare. I mean, from what we're going to discuss in a minute, like this whole entire thing, they believe they've done a really good job, but it's an actual forensic nightmare. But to have your own blood at the scene of the crime, really, really stupid. But in the frenzy of it all, I mean, 17 times, it's got to be a really frenzied attack. He's not really registering in his head that he's made this fatal error. So afterwards, Nick went to the bathroom where Gypsy was hiding. So while she was in there, Nick was apparently having some sort of tidy up. Gypsy had found the time to shave her legs and her pubic area. And obviously this is something that Dee Dee would never have allowed, but this was Gypsy's way of reclaiming her womanhood. I think at this point Gypsy had finally realised how old she actually was, I believe. I might be wrong about that. I think that, but I'm sure, like she finds out that she's actually in her early 20s at this point. It was said that Nick, while he was stabbing Dee Dee, he was shouting, "Never come between me and Ruby again." So obviously just going into complete character play at this point. And he said that he had a very fleeting moment of thinking about raping Dee Dee, but he ultimately decided against this. So after this had happened, Nick then went to the bathroom, and it was said that they decided that there was a code on the way that he was going to knock. So I think it was like 3 knocks, 2 scratches. And when he does this, Gypsy opens the door, and I think he said something about he wanting to rape her or whatnot, and Gypsy said no, that she didn't want that to happen to her mother, and she ended up giving him her body. And in Nick's own words, they reportedly had all 3 on Gypsy's bed. So that alludes to oral, vaginal, and anal sex. So after this, they ended up taking $4,000 in cash that Dee Dee had been keeping in the house, and most of this was from child support checks. And she removed any evidence that said that Gypsy actually lived in the house. And they fled to a motel outside of Springfield, and they stayed there for a few days while they planned their next move. And during that time, they were seen on security cameras at several stores. And Gypsy genuinely believed that the two had gotten away with their crime at this point. But the truth of the matter was, no one had actually reported Dee Dee missing or Gypsy missing. No one had actually obviously seen Dee Dee or Gypsy at this point, but there was nothing suspicious about the house. So obviously Dee Dee lay dead in the house for quite some time. They ended up mailing the murder weapon back to Nick's house in Wisconsin to avoid being caught with it, and they jumped on a bus there. And several witnesses who saw them on the way to the Greyhound station noticed that Gypsy wore a wig for the whole entire time, and she was walking around unaided. So around that time they get back to the house, the pair set up and they write concerning Facebook messages on Gypsy and Dee Dee's joint Facebook profile. And these messages say, "The bitch is dead, and I slashed that fat pig and raped her sweet innocent daughter. Her scream was so fucking loud, lol." This basically just concerned everyone who knew Dee Dee and Gypsy, because obviously they had never heard either of them swear before, let alone use that kind of language, and they suspected something was amiss. So the phone calls went unanswered, and several friends and families they went to the house. And while the neighbours knew that the two of them often left on medical trips unannounced, they noticed that the modified car that was gifted to them, this was still in the driveway. So protective film on the windows that Dee Dee had actually put up to stop people looking in. This made it really difficult for anyone to see through into the house, to see what was going on. And no one was answering the door, so they ended up having to call 911. And it wasn't until the police arrived they had to wait for a search warrant to be issued before they could enter. But they allowed one of the neighbours present to climb through a window, and he noticed that the inside of the house was largely undisturbed and that Gypsy's wheelchairs were still present. So it was said at this point that the house itself, even though it was undisturbed, it was an absolute tip. So it pointed out that Dee Dee, not only did she potentially have Munchausen's, I say potentially because she never got diagnosed, and obviously you can't diagnose someone who's dead. So not only that, but she also had a really bad habit for hoarding. And if you look at hoarding in general, it's actually on the OCD spectrum. So obviously I know a lot of us, we consider OCD to just basically mean you're compulsively tidy, but it's not. It's, when you're a hoarder, it's because you form an emotional attachment to that particular object, and you can't think about life without that particular object, and it soon just spirals out of control. And it is actually classed under as a form of OCD. It's like everything is on a spectrum. So when the warrant was issued, the police entered the house and they eventually found Dee Dee's body, and a GoFundMe account was set up to pay for Dee Dee's funeral and possibly Gypsy's, and all who knew the Blanchards feared the worst. And even if Gypsy had not been harmed, they believed that she would be helpless without a wheelchair, without medications and a support equipment like the oxygen tanks. And Alia, who was among the ones that had gathered on the lawn, she told police that she knew about Gypsy and her secret boyfriend, and showed them the printouts that she had saved, which included his name. And based on that information, police asked Facebook to track the IP address from which the post Dee Dee's account had been made, and it turned out to be in Wisconsin. And the next day, police agencies in Waukesha County they raided Nick's Big Bend house. And Nick and Gypsy, they surrendered and were taken into custody on charges of murder and felony and armed criminal action. So while in police custody, Gypsy, I think she was quite forthcoming with the police about the conditions that she was led to believe all her life. And when it came down to interviewing Nick, I think the police, they took a little bit of pity on Gypsy, and it's kind of not difficult to see why. You've got a young girl telling you that she was led to believe that she had all these ailments, but she was physically fine, and the medical reports are there to back her up. I mean, obviously they've only got to call around the hospitals and whatnot, because Gypsy's fallen into the person. Gypsy is actually a really intelligent woman, and she was able to back all this up and was able to give them information about the hospitals. The police were able to ring the hospitals, and this was all basically confirmed. When it came to interviewing Nick, the police played it really dirty, and they basically lied to Nick and said that Gypsy had given them a full and frank confession. And she hadn't. She had not said anything about Nick at this point. And this is something that police do quite commonly. If they've got two co-defendants, they'll play one off against the other, and this worked, and Nick fell for it hook, line and sinker. It's something that I don't agree with, but at the end of the day, if you've got someone in for a crime this serious, you want to try and get to the bottom of it as quick as you can, because there's probably nothing more frustrating for the police to go through than a case that goes unsolved for months or years. Not that this one would have, by the way, because how appalling it was actually treated, but in their heads, in their heads, especially Nick's. I mean, obviously, we're going to get onto Nick in a little bit more about his mind, but in his head, he thinks he's committed the perfect thing, and all in the name of love. And this has obviously gone disastrously wrong for him. And this is when Nick then ended up giving a full frank confession of his own. So the news that Gypsy was then safe was released to the media, and this was greeted with relief in Springfield, and Nick and Gypsy were soon extradited and held on a £1 million bond. But in announcing the news, Greene County Sheriff Jim Arnott warned, things are not always what they seem. The media in Springfield so reported the truth of the Blanchard's lives, that Gypsy had never been sick and had always been able to walk, but her mother made her pretend otherwise, using the physical abuse to control her. And Jim urged people not to donate money to the family until the investigations were brought forward about the extent of the fraud. So eventually, obviously, all the information about Gypsy's life started coming out in the mainstream, and the public sympathy towards her started coming back, obviously for a completely different reason. And while the charges of first-degree murder can carry the death penalty under the Missouri law, and this could be without or life without parole, County Prosecutor Dan Patterson announced that he would not seek it for either Gypsy or Nick, calling the case extraordinary and unusual. And after the attorney obtained her medical reports from Louisiana, he basically secured a plea deal to second degree murder for Gypsy. And Gypsy was so undernourished at this point that during the first year in county jail, her lawyer told her, sorry, was said to her lawyer said that Gypsy had ended up gaining 14 pounds, which was really, really rare for anyone who went to prison at this time. You know, the stress sometimes causes them to stop eating, they end up losing weight, but this was the first time that he ever heard of someone who was that ill that they actually gained weight while in prison. In July 2015, she accepted the plea bargain and she was then sentenced to 10 years in prison. And after the disclosure of how Dee Dee, sorry, uh, after obviously the whole disclosure, yeah, she's sent to 10 years imprisonment. She's told that she needs to serve at least 85% of this before she can be considered for parole. On the flip side, Nick, so he still faced a more severe charge of first degree murder. And this was because prosecutor contended that he initiated the murder plot. He and Gypsy agreed that he was the one that would kill Dee Dee. And he was also more severely prosecuted due to the different personal circumstances. So Nick was afforded a lot less sympathy and understanding due to his lack of involvement in abuse, and Gypsy's plea bargain agreement did not require her to testify for him or against him. In January 2017, his trial was postponed when prosecuted requested a second psychiatric exam, and his lawyers contended that he had only an IQ of 82 and that he was on the autism spectrum. This suggested at this particular time that he had a diminished capacity, and he initially waived his own right to a trial by jury, but then changed his mind later on that year. December 2017, the judge set Nick's trial for November 2018, and in their opening statement, prosecutors alleged Nick had deliberated for over a year before the crime, while the lawyers pointed to his autism and said that Gypsy had formulated the crime and their love-struck client had just done as she asked. So this I kind of am on the side with, because it was proven, and Gypsy said that the whole entire thing was her idea, but in her head it was all fantasy. It was a fantasy play that her and Nick were going on about with obviously when they were playing Victor and Ruby. And then obviously all of a sudden the next thing you know it's all become real. So obviously it started getting real at some point, and Gypsy believes that obviously this is the only way that, you know, she would be free of her mother, because obviously, as we already discussed, Gypsy did try to escape at one point and her mum just brought her straight back. The next day, the prosecutors showed the juries the text messages, sometimes the sexually explicit ones, and that these are the ones that Gypsy and Nick shared in the week before the murder, and often talking as their various personas. They also produced the knife that Nick had used in the murder. In some of the texts, he asked for details about Dee Dee's room and sleeping habits, and these were supplemented by the video of his interview after his arrest. And this is obviously just where Nick spoke about everything, under the impression that Gypsy had already dobbed him in. So Gypsy testified on the trial's third day. She said that while she indeed suggested to Nick that he kill Dee Dee to end the abuse, she also did consider getting pregnant by him in hope that once she was carrying Nick's child, Dee Dee would have to accept him, which really highlights Gypsy's naivety. So along with the knife that she gave to Nick, she also stole baby clothes from Walmart at this point. And she said that Nick never actually gave her a response or told her his feelings about the pregnancy plan. So after 4 days, the case was sent to a jury, and jurors had the option of either finding Nick guilty of one or three murder charges, involuntary manslaughter, second degree or first degree murder, or not guilty of any of them. After approximately 2 hours deliberation, they returned with the verdict that Nick was found guilty of the first degree murder and armed criminal action, and this was in February 2019. He was ended up being sentenced to prison, life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an extra 25 years. And this was the only possible outcome for them, in their eyes, as the death penalty had been declined. So Nick then asked Judge Davids for leniency. So Dwayne Perry, who was Nick's lawyer, asked for a new trial, and he argued that the jury should not have been allowed to hear that Nick had been considered raping Dee Dee on the night of the murder, and also argued that the state's psychologist should not have been allowed to testify, while Nick's psychologist should have. This was to establish that he had diminished capacity. In denying the motion, Jones conceded that an appeals court should find the latter significant and consider it a reversible error. So, obviously, the neighbours at this point of Gypsy and Dee Dee, they were just absolutely disgusted, shocked, and whatnot, to know that everything they were led to believe was completely fabricated. And Alia, whose information about Gypsy's relationship with Nick led the police to the couple the day after Dee Dee's body was discovered, she cried out of disbelief upon hearing that Gypsy had never been sick or disabled, and her mum recalled how everyone accepted Dee Dee, accepted her claims without asking for proof, and they wondered whether they had been secretly laughing at their naivety. And a lady called Kim Blanchard, who was had no relationship with them, that she wasn't a family member, she just happened to have the same surname. She called the deputy sheriffs to the houses on the night before and said, "What have I been believing? How could I have been so stupid?" And over 60 people attended a candlelight vigil for Dee Dee in downtown Springfield the night after her body was discovered. In a news conference, it was said that Springfield is a giving community. We surround people with love and finances, and we believe for whoever we believe needs it. However, a lot of times we are deceived, and I think this is now so true. This case in hand, only one of the charities that helped the Blanchards spoke after the revelations. A spokesman for Habitat for Humanity, whose volunteers helped build the house, said, "We are really deeply saddened by the whole situation." So, Gypsy, she served her time at Missouri's Chillicothe Correctional Center, and she did not tilt to the media until she had made her plea. And when she did, she told BuzzFeed that she had been able to research Munchausen syndrome by proxy, and this was on a prison computer, and that her mum had every symptom. She said, I think she would have been the perfect mum for someone who was actually sick. So Gypsy said that she believed Dee Dee's claim that she had cancer, and even though she knew she could walk and eat solid food, this led to her just basically accepting the head shavings. But she said she always hoped doctors would see through the act, see through the ruse, and she was frustrated that no one besides Flasterstein actually ever did. So Michelle Dean, the reporter from BuzzFeed, asked her what made her want to escape the situation. And Gypsy recalled the 2011 incident at a science convention, which made her wonder why she was not allowed to have friends of anyone her own age. And she said that while Nick took their idle discussions of murder into reality, she accepted that she committed a crime and has to live with the consequences. She said that, however, she hopes to help other abuse victims. On June 27th, 2022, Gypsy married a man called Ryan Scott Anderson. And this is someone that basically she became pen pals with while she was in prison. And I know there's a recurring joke right now at the moment that Scott is the spitting image of Dee Dee. And I think there's another joke where it's actually that Dee Dee hadn't actually died at all, and she was now living the life as Scott just to regain her control over her daughter. Like, this stuff is actually out there. It's what people are coming up with. Just, people just like to take the mick, really. On September 29th to 2023, the Department of Corrections confirmed that Gypsy had been granted parole, and she was then released on the 28th of December, so only a few days ago, after serving 85% of her sentence per the state law, and this was as agreed at her court. The Flasterstein, the paediatric neurologist who believed Gypsy was capable of walking on her own, wrote in his notes about the Munchausen by proxy. He said it was the only second such possible case he had ever come across. He learned of Dee Dee's murder later in 2015 when a former nurse emailed him the news saying, "Poor Gypsy." He said she suffered all them years and for no apparent reason. And he told Dean he wished that he could have done more. And that is basically the end of this story from what I could find and the information I could gather. So I would like to know your opinions on Gypsy's sentencing and Nick's sentencing. I know there's a lot of people that believe that Gypsy should still be in prison. There's a lot of people like myself believe that, after the years and years of abuse that she had suffered at the hands of her mother, she should never have gone there in the first place. I believe, personally, the right sentence for her was to have some sort of liberties taken away from her and maybe live under controlled supervision with her father. But I don't make the law. I know there's also a lot of people who believe that Nick basically deserves his sentence of obviously his life without parole, and the fact that he's going to die behind bars one day. I don't believe he deserves that sentence either. Yeah, what he did was really bad. Don't get me wrong. In his head, because obviously as we already discussed, he only had an IQ of 82. in his head, he probably thought that he was doing the right thing by the woman he loved, and he still professes his love to Gypsy to this day. And Gypsy, she said that, looking back to her, it was just infatuation, but Nick believes that they're still in love. And I don't know, from what I understand, there is an appeal process at the moment for Nick going ahead. I really do hope that it's successful for him for a multitude of reasons. Um, so here's hoping. I know, like I said, obviously there's a lot of people that believe that he's in the right place of because of the details of the murder, and for the fact that he said that for a fleeting moment he thought about raping Dee Dee. But I would love to know your thoughts and feelings on this case. If you just drop any comments or anything at the bottom, you can like, share, and subscribe. That'd be really appreciated. And I will see you guys next week for the next case. Until then, stay safe, and I'll see you soon.